Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome back to module 2 of our lecture series on cultural studies. We've already done part 1 of one of the key concepts that we are dealing with in this course, namely ideology, and we have just began to unpack, okay, the various contours and nuances of the term ideology. We are now in part 2 of the lecture on ideology. As you are aware, these lectures are being recorded mainly for the students of engineering colleges all over our country, and those who are interested from abroad, and it's not really, though it is targeted, the main target is engineering students. My hope is that students in the humanities, who of course know so many of these topics, would find these lectures useful, if only to recapitulate on what they have learned earlier. It is the NPTEL, or the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, that are bringing to you these lecture series. So, as always, we will now do a recap of what we have learned so far as the last module is concerned. Quickly, we saw that we have moved, it was in the beginning of the course really that we had moved into the new cultural studies. We had left behind the basically and largely anthropological focus on culture as a way of life, and we should remind ourselves once again that we are looking at culture as meaning making, okay, what Clifford Gates had so aptly termed, the webs of significance, or the webs of creation, or the networks, okay, of meaning and value that we ascribe to different cultural phenomena. We also saw that Chris Barker had at one time even said that the concept of ideology is so very seminal, so important, okay, and so, as he says, influential in cultural studies, that at one time the field of cultural studies was dubbed ideological studies. Then we saw different or a variety of definitions of the term ideology, and you will recall that we saw ideology as a set of ideas, as consciousness, and what was the term? Received consciousness, if you remember, and as a worldview, as something that may go on to be a doctrine or a set of rules to be strictly followed. And as I said, importantly, it is ideology is seen as maps of meaning, okay, something that carries you or points you towards meaning creation. Then we also looked at at how ideology, how we end up consuming ideology. We have to remember that before consumption of these views, ideas, values, and meanings, okay, these have to come to us. And how do they come to us? They come to us through certain institutionalized processes that have to do with the production of such meaning, values, and ideas in the first place. Then there has to be a system of distributing them. For instance, as I said, mass media could very well be one one way of getting ideology to people, and in those senses ideology is of course manufactured, and our consumption our consumption of ideology or ideological artifacts or ideas, thoughts, etc. are therefore given to us through institutionalized processes. Herein a second point comes to mind which I have to mention, is that in the whole process of consuming ideology, okay, we would do well to remember what goes into the manufacture of such things, okay, into the manufacture of in the manufacture and production and distribution of ideology. Now, I will take you back, if you recall, to my lectures, 2 lectures on Marxism that I had given, and many of you would remember this very important sentence from Marx, and I quote, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class." We cannot overstate this, in the sense that this is so seminal that it can never be an exaggeration. Okay, this I have brought this quotation from Marx back from those lectures to you here again. Why? Because this relates to what we have just spoken about. Okay, is the manufacturing of ideology. Okay, so a very obvious question that comes to our mind is, okay, ideology is produced, it is distributed, and before it is eventually consumed by us, isn't it an important question to ask, who creates it? Okay, who produces ideology? And Marx has a clear answer to this. He says that the ruling ideas, now just supplant this with the term ideology, and you will understand how it ties in, how it is so seminal to our understanding of ideology. The ruling ideas or the ideologies, right, of each age have ever been the ideologies of its ruling class. Now, you will recall that class is the most important, perhaps the most important term in in Marxism. Marx saw each epoch being informed by the conflict between 2 large classes. Okay, whether it was in ancient slavery, the conflict between the masters and the slaves, whether it was in feudalism, the class conflict between 2 classes, that of the feudal overlords and the serfs or the vassals. Okay, then we saw in capitalism, we saw the 2 classes of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Okay, so there, according to the Marxist schema, each and every epoch, okay, is characterized by class conflict. And in this case, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class, would mean that these 2 major classes in every age, okay, it was the privileged class, it was the class that had power of governance, of wealth, of economics. It was that class that defined the ruling ideas. It was that class that defined the ideology. It was that class that produced and then distributed the central ideas, or you can say the central doctrines that were to be followed by everyone. Okay? So, this is where the political, this is where issues of power come in between. So, we have to remember that whenever we consume an ideology, we have to also ask, very importantly ask, who has produced it, by what means has this ideology been disseminated to us, how much of it do I consume, how much of it do I critique, how much of it do I discard. Okay? So, Marx of course is central in any discussion of ideology. Okay? Look at it in a different way in this slide. ideology is or affects through a dominant class. Ideology is something that affects matter and mind. Now, what does this mean? To say that ideology affects both matter and mind, or that to say it in another way, ideology is both material and mental, okay, of matter and of mind, and that it comes through us through the filter of a class, which in a certain period of time is the dominant class. Okay. It means that is matter or the economic base. Remember, we had looked at the two terms base and superstructure, and we found that it is the economic base comprising what? Comprising the forces of production and the relations of production, in a word, the modes of production, okay, that determine the superstructure that rises above it. There is this architectural metaphor here, as we all know, okay, based on our material reality, based on economics, based on the way wealth is distributed, labor is distributed, demarcated, divided, okay, on that arises a superstructure. I would hasten to remind you once again that this determination is in no way a deterministic one. Okay. The point here is there is a relation between the material base. So, there is a relation, I say, between the matter, okay, the matter that gives rise to the mind, the matter that gives rise to the superstructure. Now, the superstructure is where we would eventually place ideology. Okay. Superstructure comprises what? Superstructure comprises all these institutions that we have, the family, the legal system, the judicial system, the mass media, the educational system, okay. Any institution of society, whether tangible or intangible, fall under the superstructure. Okay. And if you may well put all of these into one term. You can put them into one term, and that term we would call ideology. Okay. And hence, ideology filtered through a class is both a material and a mental matter, so to speak. Okay. Then we saw, we ended with political ideologies, and we talked about just a few, and I said there are so many really. We talked about liberalism, and remember what was our important point there? Our point was political ideologies have as their goal the organization, okay, the organization of society in a way in which each of these ideologies feel, okay, is conducive or is the ideal way in which people should be governed, in which people should be arranged, their lives should be arranged in society or in a culture. So, given that, we found that some of the ideologies, political ideologies may be liberalism, the ideology called capitalism, communism, environmentalism, feminism, anarchism, etc. Okay, so, these are the political ideologies. Now, we will move on to the rest of this lecture, and I will begin by quoting Chris Barker. Barker's text, Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice, you recall, is a text which I said may well be a textbook in any cultural studies course, and along with his making sense of cultural studies. Though I talk about several other books, many other authors and their articles, okay, if you want to really be guided in theory of cultural studies, this is one person to look at. Now, let us see what Barker says. Barker says, today the notion of ideology at best implies the binding and justifying ideas of all social groups. There are these two terms, actually, if I look at these two terms, binding and justifying. Okay? Why binding? Binding because the set of ideas, or if you say the ruling ideas, to use Marx's term, the ruling ideas of a society are the ideas which the dominant group would want people to accept, to give them a certain sense of being bound in a sense of being bound, or in the sense of being related, right, to one another. Could be here binding would mean to help people forge a collective identity as a community, okay, that this is what we are, this is the way we should look at the world, this is the way our society runs, and as every dominant group would want people to believe, this is the optimal way in which we are bound together as members of a community, right. And the second word, justifying, look at these words, the binding and justifying ideas of all social groups. These, in order to have to, if you are expected to incorporate that particular ideology or set of ideologies. For instance, let me give you an example. Within say a religious setup, you have a worldview, the sense that if you are maybe a Hindu, if you are a practicing Hindu, it's a different thing to be born into a Hindu family and a different thing to be a practicing Hindu. Many people who are born into a religious setup may end up being atheists. That is why I am saying, if you are a practicing Hindu, then the dominant view of your religion would want you to have a certain worldview. A worldview here means not simply a view of what the world is, what it is made up about, it also includes your place in it. Okay? So, for instance, you may believe that you are here on in this birth to work out your personal karmas, to redress some of the things that were done in your previous life, so that you sort of graduate into a better life in your next life. Okay? That is an ideology, that is a worldview, right, and that has to be justified. That has to be justified, that there has to be enough persuasion, so that you are you don't not only feel justified, you also feel related to similar practitioners. Do you follow? In the same way, for instance, let us look at capitalism as a political ideology, right? And we talked about Hinduism as a religious ideology, and capitalism as a political ideology. That ideology would want the subjects to believe that individualism is one that characterizes human beings more than cooperation. On the other hand, the worldview within a communist setup would be not competition, but cooperation. You see how, given different ideologies, you have different worldviews, and as Barker says here, what is important, that you should have a feeling of being bound, so to speak, related, so to speak, to the people in your community, in your group, sharing an ideology, sharing a worldview which is justified, which seems to be the best thing possible. Okay? Now, having talked just a bit about Karl Marx, I spoke at length in the 2 lectures on Marxism, so I am not bringing in Marxism again in a big way, but we can look at the French philosopher Louis Althusser. Okay, Louis Althusser here is important because will take us to more theorizations of ideology. Althusser says this. Now look at this. 1. There is no practice except by and in an ideology. Look at this. There is no practice except by, and in an ideology. What does it mean? What is the practice being talked about here? Okay, the practice here is the practice we call cultural practice. Okay, cultural practice here means the myriad ways in which we practice life, as it were, okay, in which we live out our lives, right. So, he says here that there cannot be any cultural practice, there cannot be any living out of our lives, okay, in what Hall called the grounded terrain of our material practices, of our beliefs, etc., okay, but only through ideology. That is, we live, this practice is by an ideology, okay. By an ideology here means both constituted and constructed by an ideology, and by also in the sense of following an ideology, okay, by both constituted and by as in following something, okay, by and in an ideology. So, you do not really see ideology. Ideology is not something that you can go and catch and go and feel and touch, okay, but in an ideology is that space, right, is that mental, intellectual, emotional, space, remember, where identities are created, where subjectivities are created. Now, you understand why we had to talk about identity and subjectivity before we talked about ideology, and how it ties into this to this lecture, that there is, we work all these out, we work out our cultural lives in the arena, so to speak, okay, in the arena of ideology, right. Second, look at the next point here. He says there is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects, okay. I am reading it again. There is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects, in the sense that there there cannot be any cultural practice without an ideology, and B, in this second point, is that where is the question of having an ideology if there is nobody to construct it in the first place, and there is nobody for which it is constructed, okay. Now, this points to a very important fact here, is that it is the subject, the one that experiences, okay. Remember our points on subjectivity, it is the one that experiences, okay. It is the subject that creates, it is by the subject, it is created by the subject, and also for subjects, okay, that is for people. So, what do we learn from these two postulations here? A is that there can be no working out of our cultural lives or our everyday lives, of everything that has to do with culture. Remember the webs of significance and meaning making. It is possible only, okay, in an arena, in a mental space, so to speak, okay, of course, given rise to by matter, okay, by our material lives, called ideology. And second, there is no ideology that has not been by the subject and created for the subject, right. So, looking at it in diagrammatically, we can therefore see that cultural practices, ideology and the subject are all intertwined, right. Ideology is something, is the arena, okay, where we have the subject as, call it an agent, the subject is a creator, at the same time the subject is a performer, okay, and the subject is the one that carries out the cultural practices, and the cultural practices in turn are largely dependent on the ideology, right. So, this is a schematic way of showing the same thing that was said by Althusser just a while ago, okay. Fine. Now, let us look at another postulation by Althusser. He says, you and I are always already, now this is a beautiful way of putting it, always already. That is, you are, and I'll talk about this just a while, let me read this. You and I are always already subjects, and as such constantly practice the rituals of ideological recognition, which guarantee for us that we are indeed concrete, individual, distinguishable and naturally irreplaceable subjects. Okay. Now, in the first case, look at this, you and I are always already subjects, always already. Here always already means a certain givenness. Okay? There is a certain givenness. Okay? We are always already subjects, that is our subjectivity, our subjecthood, our experience, okay, or what we are going to experience as we enter the social arena, as we are socialized, is already demarcated for us. Okay? We should not think that this is a certain passivity that he is talking about. Okay? We sort of enter an arena that has already been laid out to us by tradition, by the practices that are continuing. Okay? We do not enter into something that has been sort of tailor made for us, or that we immediately plunge into and start creating for ourselves. Look at this, you and I are always already subjects. Okay? And as such, we constantly practice the rituals of ideological recognition. Okay? Look at the term rituals. We perform. Just a while ago I had said that we are, we saw that schematic, the diagram, that we are not just creators. Okay? Remember, by subjects and for subjects. We are also performers. Okay? We learn to imbibe. We learn to imbibe the rituals, say, of ideological recognition. A beautiful phrase, rituals of ideological recognition. What does it mean? That the whole process of recognizing every part of the ideology is ritualized. Just like, say, all of us go through certain rites, R-I-T-E-S, rites of growing up, what we call rites of passage. These rites of passage are, say, unique or individualized as far as all of us are concerned, each of us is concerned. But these are also rituals that we recognize, others recognize even as we pass through these rituals. Okay? So, this is a really a sophisticated way of talking about ideology. Now, I would like to quote from Douglas M. Kellner and Meenakshi Durham from their reader on very important reader on cultural studies, on media studies. Okay? They show the connection here with Karl Marx. Okay? Beginning with Marx's thesis that the mode of production determines the character of social, intellectual and cultural life, Althusser sees ideology as an effect of the structure of society. Okay? Remember, we began with Marx, and this is how Kellner and Durham are joining Marx and Althusser, and sees how Althusser goes on to improvise what Marx has said, that Marx's thesis, okay, that the base, the mode of production determines the superstructure or the ideology of, or the character, the nature of the social cultural life. What Althusser does here is, he sees ideology as an effect of the structure of society. Okay? So, ideology here is the effect of how society is structured, and it is, look at this word, first is it is an effect, then it is a force in which economic, political, legal, cultural and ideological practices are interrelated to shape social consciousness. Okay? So, what is then Althusser's contribution here is, he sees ideology as an effect of the structure of our society, and B, it is a force in which the practices are interrelated and which go on to, again, as if coming full circle, go on to shape social consciousness. So, this is known as, look at this term here, structural Marxism. Okay? Althusser in this sense is a structuralist. He sees all these aspects of Marxism in structuralist sense, in the sense of systems, in the sense of cultures, or of structures. So, in Althusser's version of structural Marxism, ideological state apparatuses, this is a very important point. One of the reasons why I brought Althusser here, or we have to bring Althusser here in the first place, is talking about the apparatuses. I'll describe them just in a while. Okay, I'll just read it and then we'll go on to talk about it again, unpack it. In Althusser's version of structural Marxism, ideological state apparatuses like schooling, media, the judiciary, etc., interpolated individuals into preconceived forms of subjectivity that left no space for opposition or resistance. This is Kellner and Durham offering both a description and perhaps a critique, okay, of Althusser's reworking of Marxism, okay, of Marx's idea of ideology. Okay. They call it, or they may not have been the first to call it, but it is usually said that Althusser is a structuralist Marxist. And there is this very important word called interpellation, which I will talk about just in a while, that the ideological forms, they interpellate or call upon people, okay, into, look at this word, preconceived forms of subjectivity that left no space for opposition opposition or resistance. Many critics of Althusser, okay, in fact many critics of anyone who has come after Marx and have tried, those who have tried to, you know, improvise on Marx and, you know, give additions or contributions or reinterpretations of Marx, all of them have come into critique. It may seem in a structuralist that, you know, when Althusser gives us a structuralist explanation, it may seem, and it has seemed to many critics, that it takes away the revolutionary element that is there in classical Marxism. Okay. For instance, when we say that, you know, the ideological forms like schooling, okay, the education system, the media, the judiciary, etc., that they call upon individuals, okay, and they put them into certain already existing, okay, forms of subjectivity. Now you will perhaps understand in a better way the use of Althusser's term always already. If you remember, just a while ago we had spoken about always already, that there is a givenness to subjectivity. This, as I said, many feel takes away the revolutionary element of the agency, I mean the agency of human beings, okay, because Althusser is looking at us as being always called upon by ideological systems to fit into preconceived forms of subjectivity. That is said here, look at this slide please, that left no space for opposition or resistance, right. Now, we will talk about what these apparatuses are. Okay. First is the ideology and ideological state apparatuses. Okay. There are two types of apparatuses that were brought to our attention by Althusser, and they are, one, ideological state apparatuses or ISA, and number two, they are the repressive state apparatuses or the RSS. So, the ISAs and RSS as we talk about them in short form are the two kinds of apparatuses that are used by society to make us, as he says, always already subjects of a given ideological configuration. Now, I am quoting from Althusser himself. Please look at this slide. I shall call ideological state apparatuses a certain number of realities which present themselves to the immediate observer in the form of distinct and specialized institutions. Okay. These distinct and specialized institutions are not institutions that use force. Okay. That is, there are a plurality of ideological state apparatuses. That is, state here is what? The state is obviously here we know is not, you know, the state of Assam or Manipur or Andhra Pradesh. The state here is the government. Okay. So, every government, which is what Marx would call the ruling class, okay, every government has of course, roughly what Marx would call the ruling class. Every government has certain forms and what Althusser calls a plurality of forms, okay, through which ideology is tried to be disseminated. Remember, produced and distributed and consumed. Okay, ideology is sought to be distributed. So he says that there are many such ideological state apparatuses. Remember, look at the word, resonance of the word apparatus. He is not using words like branches or forms or anything. He is using apparatuses. This really brings to us the instrumentalization. Apparatus is something you would use in a laboratory, for instance. Okay, apparatus brings to us the resonance of words of something like instrumentalization. Now, instrumentalization of our lives by the state in its different forms is something which again ties in very neatly to what Althusser calls are always already ready for use subjectivities. Okay. Now, unpacking this, the ideological state. Now, what are these ideological state apparatuses? What are these ideological state instruments? One, the religious ideological state apparatus. The religious, I say, are, for instance, in a Christian country, the system of the different churches. Okay, so the church, the religion is also seen as an ideological form, and the various religious institutions are the apparatuses or the instruments through which certain ideologies are sought to be distributed in society as desirable, as desirable ideologies. Then education. Education, according to Althusser, we know education is a part of the superstructure in the Marxist schema. Education is the system of the different public and private schools that we have. Okay, the educational system decides what is going to be taught. Now, that too may be seen as an apparatus because of the very instrumentality. Okay, that is there. It tells us what to read. It decides beforehand what is to be disseminated in the name of, and that is why there is a certain instrumentalization in this ideological form called education. The family. Okay. Today, we can safely say, even looking back at history and looking even to our, societies, okay, that the family is perhaps the oldest social institution, but see how the family has changed. Okay, when we look at mythologies, when we look at certain tales, for instance, in a certain epoch, it would not raise anyone's eyebrows to say that a king had 300 wives, okay, or that the king had so many concubines, and there would be the chief queen, etc. Okay, so that would be some sort of an extended family, right? Today we have different kinds of families. We have the joint family that still survives, and there are then the nuclear family with just the father, the mother, and the children. There is a family where there are adopted children. There are even gay families or homosexual families where the two members are of the same sex and they adopt children. Okay, or they have they have a family. So we see that but even though there is a sort of tolerance of all forms of families, it wouldn't be wrong to say that in any given setup where there is ideology, okay, there is also the ideology of what is the ideal family. Okay, the ideal family today is certainly not the family of or a situation or it is not supposed to be. I wouldn't say, in many tribes still there are many communities in which you will find that it is not unnatural at all. It is not it's not something out of the ordinary for a household to have one man with his 3 or 4 wives and their extended children. Okay, it is after all a form of the family. Okay, but there is always the the ideology which says that kind of family is not the ideal kind of family. It is the individual family with the nuclear family with the mother and the father and the 2 children, okay, which is supposed to be the best family. Now, how do we call it the best form of family? Okay, how do we measure it? There is no natural way of measuring it. There are different kinds of families. Okay, how can you say that the homosexual or the gay family is something that that is a wrong sort of family? No, this ties into the kind of government and the tolerance that the government, and also in an intolerant situation, the instrumentalization of what a family should be like. Okay, so the sort of the normalization of what family should be, the normalization, that is normalization in the sense of following norms of what religion should be or religious experience should be, what the education or the best kind of school should be, is not something that is natural. It is created. That is most important. It is created and it is upheld to be the best kind that that mankind has sort of evolved, evolved to have. Then the others are, if you look at the slide, the legal system. Okay, the same thing follows for the legal system. What was legal what is legal today was not legal a couple of years ago. Okay, it was not legal a century ago. Okay, or what is illegal today will in many cases not be legal a couple of years later. Okay, it is important to realize that the legal system, the laws are created, and the legal system is a very important part of what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatuses. Okay, perhaps the instrumentality of the legal and the judicial system, the instrumentalization of our lives is at its peak when we talk about these two forms of ideological state apparatuses, or ISA, that is the judicial form and the legal forms. Okay, these actually carry out the instrumentalization of our lives. Then the trade union, the communications, that is the press, radio, television, etc. Then the cultural systems like literature, arts, sports, all these are, if we unpack the term ideological state apparatuses, all these are forms. Now, if you just simply look at the list, it's amazing, how there's always already that, so Althusser says so beautifully, is created for us. But we have to understand, we have to remind ourselves that this list, okay, is something that is not a given. And what the earlier Marxists, or rather the classical view of Marxism says, that the revolutionary element should be there. It's not just that we simply understand the ways in which life is instrumentalized by the ideological state apparatuses. One has to go forward in order to contest those, that the processes of normalization that are there. Next is the other aspect of ideology, which is what Althusser calls the repressive state apparatuses. Obviously, by the moment we use a word like repressive, you will understand that there is a certain amount of violence. Okay? By here, violence, I do not mean only physical violence, only coercion. Violence also means coercion of our mental forms, coercion of our thoughts, for instance. Okay, the violence of our thoughts. Now, let us look at this quickly. Repressive state apparatuses. If you look at this slide, the repressive state apparatus, or RSA, Althusser quotes here, functions by violence, whereas the ideological state apparatuses function by ideology. What are the repressive state apparatuses? The repressive state apparatuses may be the state instruments that are used to repress, life, repress our social life, and these are the police, the armed forces, where and there may be situations like what we had in India in the emergency, certain situations in which it's not just there is only violence, only open violence or violent repression, there is also the curtailing of so many of our rights. So, the situations like the emergency may not happen all the time, but certainly the very presence of the police, the very presence of the armed forces, okay, are a sign that the repressive state apparatuses are always present. Okay. They are there, so to speak, to be used by the state to enforce the ideologies. Okay. So, we will look at this again. The RSA, or the repressive state apparatus, functions by violence, as Althusser says, whereas the ideological state apparatuses like the media, the education, family, etc., function by ideology or values or sets of values and meanings. This is an important distinction we need to note. Okay. Now, I will read further and explain a couple of more things. I am quoting again, every state apparatus, whether repressive or ideological, functions both by violence and by ideology, but with one very important distinction which makes it imperative not to confuse the ideological state apparatus with the repressive state apparatus. This is the fact that the repressive state apparatus functions massively and predominantly by repression, including physical repression, while functioning secondarily by ideology. There is no such thing as a purely repressive apparatus. This is important. Okay. Even as we make the distinction between repressive and ideological state apparatuses, and we say that the repressive state apparatuses are purely they are purely related to force, even violence, and that the ideological state apparatuses are purely ideological, have to do with meanings. No, there is a certain sophistication to it, there is a certain interchangeability to it, there are aspects of one in the other. How? Okay. Let us look at this again. The ideological the ideological state apparatus, it does not mean that the ideological state apparatuses are not violent. Okay. Many today even say that there is even nothing called ideological state apparatuses. Many say that all apparatuses are repressive. Okay. All apparatuses are violent by degree. All apparatuses, all ideologies are coercive. Okay. You will we can refer to Antonio Gramsci, idea of hegemony. I will talk about this in a while, but again look at this, what is said here. Let's go through this again. Every state apparatus, whether repressive or ideological, functions both by violence and by ideology. That is, whether it is the ideological state apparatus or the repressive state apparatus. The important point to be noted is violence and ideology inform both, and as I said, many today say that there is nothing called ideological state apparatus. There is all kinds of apparatus, state apparatus are repressive. Okay. I am reading again, this is the fact that the repressive state apparatus functions massively and predominantly by repression, while functioning secondarily by ideology. Primarily, RSAs may function by repressive measures, by violent measures, but they are these apparatuses are also, they are informed by an ideology. For instance, it says here in brackets, there is no such thing as a purely repressive apparatus. A purely repressive apparatus would have to be a mindless one if it is not informed by ideology. Then, for example, the army and the police also function by ideology, both to ensure their own cohesion and reproduction and the values they propound externally. If you did not believe in why you are perpetrating violence, okay, then if there is not an indoctrination to a certain extent, okay, when you need to kill an enemy in war, you have to believe at least to a certain degree that it is worth your while to kill your enemy. Okay. You have to be indoctrinated beforehand that the enemy is something to be done away with, okay, for the sake of your country. So, you can't say that in the same way, even within a nation, okay, when you use the armed forces against a so-called group that is a violent group, okay, then you have to in a way be informed by an ideology that that violent group is not good for the country. Okay. So, violence itself includes ideology, and this is, I think, a good sophistication of what Althusser has said so far. Then again, look at this slide. In the same way, but inversely, okay, this in the inverse way this applies. It is essential to say that for their part, the ideological state apparatuses function massively and dominantly by ideology, but they also function secondarily by repression. The inverse is true in the case of the ISAs. Even if ultimately, but only ultimately, this is very attenuated and concealed, even symbolic. Okay? The repression that is there in ideological state apparatuses. Remember, I said that people, there are many critics who today would like to tell us that there is so much violence, okay, in ideological state apparatuses, so much violence in the education system, in the legal system, in the judicial system, in the family in fact, okay, that you can't call it an ideological state apparatus, at least in a simplistic way. Therefore, again reading, thus schools and churches use suitable methods of punishment, expulsion, selection. Okay? Look at these institutions, these superstructural institutions, they too use violence, they punish, they rusticate, they expel, okay, they use systems of selections, of gradations to discipline not only their shepherds, but also their flocks. The same is true also of the family. Okay? These may raise some uncomfortable feelings in us, in the sense that we idolize the family, we idolize and idealize the religious systems, but we have to take note of what ideological studies tells us, or what cultural studies tells us, and in this case what Althusser tells us, and our understanding of Althusser's ISAs and RSS tell us, is that things are not so simple. Right? You have to sort of remove the veneer, the veil of these so-called ideal systems, if you are to understand these in a cultural studies sort of way. In that sense, cultural studies may be sometimes a little painful, okay? But I would say, as somebody who has been teaching cultural studies, has been talking about ideology, about all these forms, that painful as they may be, these are also ways of growing up. I would now move on. We are coming to the close of this lecture, and we look at the word. Remember, there is a word interpellation which we haven't talked about, which we said is to call out. Okay? The word interpellation, which many say that has sort of reduced the revolutionary element in Althusser's instructional Marxism. Okay? Now, look at the word interpellation, and this is from Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays. Okay? I will read it out. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Ideology also has a material existence. Now, the third point is most important, third and fourth points is all ideology hails. The important word here is hails. Okay, you can, if you want a simpler word for interpellation, the word is hails. That is, interpellation is calling out to somebody, hailing somebody. When you greet somebody or you call out to somebody who is far away, okay, you hail, you beckon that person. Ideology is also to be seen according to Althusser in those terms. All ideology, okay, their forms, the beliefs, everything, all ideology hails or interpellates concrete individuals as concrete subjects, calls out. Remember, just a few slides ago we had seen that there are certain preconceived slots into which ideology tells us. For instance, the ideology, the dominant ideology of a mother. Okay, the cultural role some women play as mothers, that is also calling out by ideology. Say the best way to be a mother is this. It's like saying hello or calling out to somebody, look, this is how you should be as a mother, and all the other stories of sacrificing for your children and all the things that follow from here are nothing but ideology hailing or calling out to you to perform given that historical situation of what true motherhood is, or for instance what true nationhood is, how to be a good citizen. For instance, the ideology of good citizenry or citizenship is something that calls out to you, beckons you and tells you, look, this is the best way to be a mother, or this is the best way to be a citizen. Now, the important point to be realized here is, this is what the last point here, individuals are always already subjects. The moment you enter into the cultural arena, what happens is you are already constituted. Your roles, as in this case mother, or the role of a citizen, is always already ready for you. You just have to enter that slot. Okay. So, again Althusser on interpellation, all ideology hails or interpellates concrete individuals as concrete subjects. I shall then suggest that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it, look at the word, recruits. Okay. So, look at apparatus, instrumentalization, recruits, right, recruits subjects among the individuals, or transforms the individuals into subjects by that very precise operation which I have called, this is Althusser, which I have called interpellation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday, this should be polite, everyday polite or other hailing. Hey, you there, okay. It seems to be as simple as, hey, you there, somebody calling you, and it is not overtly by violence most of the time that this is done. It is another matter that there is a certain degree of violence done on you the moment you are being, the word used here, transformed, the moment you are being recruited. Okay, that is another matter, but it may seem to be as simple as something like saying, somebody calling out, hey, you there. Okay, and just look at the intimacy of what is of this phrase here. Then a quick look at Gramsci's concept of ideology. We do not have much time here, but we need to look at this. Its original meaning was that of the science of ideas, and since analysis was the only method recognized and applied by science, it means analysis of ideas, that is investigation of the origin of ideas. This was the concept of ideology understood simply as the science of ideas. Okay. Ideology itself must be analyzed historically in terms of the philosophy of praxis as a superstructure, and one must therefore distinguish between historically organic ideologies, those that is which are necessary to a given structure, and ideologies that are arbitrarily rationalistic or will. We can skip this for the moment and move on to what Barker has to say about Gramsci, and this is what he says. For Gramsci, ideology is grasped as ideas, meanings and practices, while they purport to be universal truths, are maps of meaning that support the power of particular social classes. This is obviously the same as what is mentioned in classical Marxism, okay? That ideology are maps of meaning that support the power of particular social classes. And the final paragraph, ideology is understood to be both lived experience and a body of systematic ideas whose role is to organize and bind together a block of diverse social elements to act as social cement, okay, in the formation of hegemonic and counter hegemonic blocks. So, there is a certain cementing of people together as a coherent whole, and which is known as hegemony, which Gramsci called consent that is manufactured without much overt violence. So, we move on quickly and end with at least those the questions relating to what we have been able to discuss so far. So, now if you ask the question, what are the various ideological state apparatuses? Now, the moment you say ideological state apparatuses, obviously Althusser has to come to your mind, and you have to define them in terms of Althusser's framework. So, this is how you would answer. You would, if it is a short answer, you simply mention these, but if it is a long answer, you have to weave these into these points, all that we have discussed so far, as so remember interpellation, instrumentalization, then the amount of repression involved in ideology, okay, all these have to be woven into the answers. But if it is a short answer, then you simply mention the religious, educational, family, legal, trade union, communication systems and cultural forms that go into the making of these ideological state apparatuses. how are the ideological state apparatuses and the RSS or the repressive state apparatuses usually differentiated? Then you need to look at it from this point of view. Simply speaking, if you look only at the difference, then the police, the armed forces that form the repressive state apparatuses function by violence, whereas the ideological apparatuses function by ideology. After mentioning this, if it is long, it is a question with more marks, then you may also say, however, this is a simplistic way of looking at it, and that in both cases the other element is also present. For instance, in RSAs or repressive state apparatuses, it is not a question of pure repression or pure violence, because that has to be backed up by a belief. Okay? For instance, as I said, you can give the example of killing an enemy in a battlefield. You have to believe that behind, or there is an ideology behind this, that the enemy is to call the enemy somebody that deserves to die has to be backed up by a certain set of ideas. Okay? And in the same way, inversely, in ideological state apparatuses, there is also a certain violence that has been that has been created. It may not be physical violence, but there is also the violence of categorizing things. Okay? The violence that is caused by leaving out other ways of thinking. Then explain the term interpellation. How would you explain the term interpellation? Then you can look at what Althusser says, that interpellation is a hailing or calling out, okay? And that interpellation, you can use other words. Once you hail out, once you respond, then you are recruited in the service of an ideology. You are then transformed according to that ideology, and that interpellation may begin with a very familiar hey you out there, okay? But once that beckoning is responded to, then it is not a very difficult step. The next step is not very difficult, that is to sort of instrumentalize, ideologize that person into a certain set of beliefs. Then how does Gramsci understand ideology? And we end with this. For Gramsci, now this is through Barker, ideology is grasped as ideas, meanings and practices. Okay? Now, remember this, look at this familiar term that we had looked at a while ago, maps of meaning that support the power of particular social classes. In this understanding of Gramsci, we find both. We find both ideology as meanings, maps of meanings, and also ideology as the power of particular ruling classes. Okay? These two elements are there present. So, in this case, despite what many may say, we cannot completely say that the revolutionary element is out when it comes to Gramsci. So, here ideology is not separate from the practical activities of life, but provides people with rules of practical conduct. Okay, the normative, ideology is normative, and therein is the violence, many would say. Okay, the moment you try and normalize things into a certain channel, into a certain set of beliefs, you have already committed a certain violence. Okay. So, rules of practical conduct, of moral behavior rooted in our day-to-day conditions. Ideology is not something that it is there outside of our society. Ideology is in us. Ideology in a way is us. Okay. So important is ideology to the study of culture, and that is why I have devoted 2 lectures to this. In the first lecture, what did we see? We saw that ideology, we saw the different nuances of the term ideology. Then we also looked very briefly at Marx's formulation that ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class. Okay. Then we looked at Althusser's differentiation between 2 types of ideological apparatuses. We also looked at certain crossings between the 2 and how they they are inversely related. One is present in the other. Then we looked at Gramsci, when we find both understanding of ideology as maps of meaning and as power are related together. Also importantly, how ideology according to Gramsci is present as hegemony, okay, throughout our lives, and our day-to-day lives are informed by ideology. And then finally, let me just read out this last part of the slide to you. Please have a look at the slide. Ideology is understood to be both lived experience, it is both lived experience and a body of systematic ideas. You cannot separate them both. Okay. It is both lived experience and the body of systematic ideas. And what is the role of ideology? The role of ideology is to organize and bind together a block of diverse social elements. okay, to give us feeling, at least a feeling that we are all related in a coherent whole, we are all following the same beliefs, the same ideas, we are all one. So, everything in an end is an ideology. Patriotism is an ideology, nationalism is an ideology, everything is an ideology. The family itself is an ideology. The educational system, which we think is the optimum in our time, is also an ideology. A way of looking at the world is a set of ideas. Okay, it sometimes goes on to become a doctrine, and most importantly, in cultural studies, particularly, it is maps of meaning, okay, or the pointers to meaning making, and to see how we may create meanings and values in our lives. So, I hope this these two lectures on ideology, there is indeed a lot more that can be said, many theories that, but at least as a beginning for you to feel necessary to even want to desire to go into further studies of ideology. I hope these two lectures have sufficed. The next lecture we are going to deal with yet another important the crucial, very central topic, a key concept, and that is that of representation. Thank you for now.